Hi everyone, my name is Cristina, and the topic of this Gallery Teacher TEFL Masterclass is Teaching Teenagers or How to Save Your Sanity. So, in this webinar, we will start with some personal experience that actually informed my teaching of this particular group. What I learned about teenagers according to their age group, and this is a very essential part of teaching teenagers, also their characteristic, generation-wise, these affect the way that they learn. All this leads to a need for autonomy and engagement in the classroom, and this means that the best or the most effective ways I found to organize lessons were teaching with task-based learning and through project work. So let me start all this with a story. Now, 10 years ago, I was in Lebanon teaching a group of teenagers doing what I really thought was a great course, teaching integrated skills. I had reading, listening, writing, speaking. But by the end of the course, one of the teenagers, in typical teenager bluntness, told me when I asked for feedback what he thought of my course. As you can see, he didn't think very highly of it. Now, he was obviously much blunter about it than this image conveys, but I was so crushed. However, after feeling crushed, I realized that I had to do some introspection, and I realized a couple of things. The first thing was that I had assumed I knew which topics teenagers in general wanted to discuss. Why? Because I failed to I failed to provide engaging material because I assumed that I knew better. I failed to understand I was actually teaching teenagers and not adults. In my mind, because I was inexperienced at the time with this particular age group, I thought that was it. I realized that I had to do some serious research. So, talking to the DOS, talking to the actual teenagers, I also researched how teenagers are an actual specific group. And through that, I agreed to implement change and some changes. So let me take you some of the findings that I discovered through research and experience, and hopefully that will help you. Now, first of all, let's have a look at how many age groups can teenagers be divided in. So in the chat, everyone, how many age groups do you think there are when it comes to teaching for teenagers? Okay, I see a couple of answers. Yes, yes, you're right. Now, you're correct. Now, within the teenager group, we tend to think about three different groups. Okay, so what do you think they can be? Yeah, I'm reading some of the answers. Yes. Okay. Now, if you look, most experts actually split this age range into three distinct groups. The first one being young teenagers, they're between 12 and 14. We've got the middle teenagers, that are the 14 to 17, and the late teenagers, 17 plus, all the way to 19. But at the moment, we would normally focus only, as I said, on two groups, young and middle teenagers, so students attending middle and high school. Why? Because in my experience, late teenagers are in most ways young adults. So they tend to be it tends to be quite different. So let's look at those two groups. Here we have some characteristics of these two groups. We got group A, young teenagers, group B, the middle teenagers, and we got characteristic group 1, characteristic group 2. Which one is which? Match the characteristic to the correct group. So is group 1 for A or group 1 for B? So tell me, group A, is it 1 or 2? Group B, is it 1 or 2? Put your answers in the chat, please. Yes. Okay, yes, you're right. So young teenagers is actually group 2. So A equals 2. We are talking about moody, egocentric. Now, these are generalization. There might be some that are not at all like this. These are the general characteristics. And for the middle teenagers, there is a difference. And this is something that is very important to notice, is that we do have certain differences. There are similarities, which we will look at, but there are also differences in the way they work independently, the fact that the independence is mostly newly acquired or quite already acquired. So that's something quite important. Now, overall, it is important to realize one thing that is in common for both groups, is that they are either undergoing or they have just recently barely finished undergoing such dramatic changes in every aspects of their life that it should be kind of no wonder that they could be a little bit moody and a bit difficult to handle at times. We tend to forget. But this is a moment, and this is a period of great upheaval for them. Okay? Remember that they are still developing. We are talking about developing cognitively, linguistically. So they're starting to think abstractly, they're starting to hypothesize, they're starting to develop maybe more tolerance as they mature cognitively. Socially, also, they are developing. Group identity that becomes more important with young teenagers and then slightly less important for middle teenagers, and they kind of wavering between wanting more independence and also a need for security, because at the end of the day, they are still, for intent and purposes, children. Emotionally, they are also still developing. We have conflict with parents. We have conflict with authority. And why? Not because they just want to be in conflict, but because they are trying to discover their identity, and they're trying to build it. And sometimes they don't know exactly where they're going. So this brings them into conflict with the people around them that they are not used to these changes. And finally, we also have teenagers, the fact that teenagers are developing physically. They're going through maturity, but remember, they do so at different ages during these periods. Some people reach physical, they reach puberty when they're 12, 13, and then some much later. So we have to know, number one, the most important thing of all this is that we have a moment of upheaval. There are changes. If we understand that these changes exist, then we are already more prepared for what's going, or how the teenagers will behave. So, as we mentioned, they are all different. Sorry, they are all different, but at the same time, kind of all the same. So what are some of the words that come to your mind when you think about teenagers, especially, and I want you to concentrate on the Gen Zs and the alphas, the ones that are teenagers now. What are some of the words, the buzzwords that we use in order to describe them? Go for it, if you can put them in the chat. Think about buzzwords, something related, really related to these generations. All right, thank you. So let's go through some of them. I'm going to show you some words, and these ones will be the ones in order to describe teenagers. Have a look very quickly. How many do you think you know their meaning? I think some of the acronyms are quite well known. All right, so some of you know some of them. All right, so let's start. So the first thing we have to know about teenagers is they are task switchers, which means that they need to do more than one task. They prefer that. They need to change from one activity to another. So in the classroom, you need to understand that even if it is one project or one task, there has to be more than, even if it's one activity, it has to be more than one task. They are also micro learners, which means that they want to do small, short activities that work better. Another word to describe them is that they are digital. So it's about connecting the physical world to the digital world. If that activity, if the activity that you've chosen connects that, then it will help them. It will help raise their engagement. Another thing about them is they are activists. They are activists online. So remember that when choosing activities. They also prosumers, meaning that they produce and consume information. In our days, very very few of us used to produce information. We used to consume them through books or later on through the internet. But now these teenagers feel like artists that can feed the net with their useful content. So it really does influence that the way that they approach information, the way they organize their ideas. Think about that in your lesson. Another very important thing is that they are failure deprived. What does that mean? They are risk adverse. They don't want to fail. If they see that there is a danger to fail, they tend to not want to do it. Why is it? Some people will say it's because they've been brought up by what is known as helicopter parents that interfere when they shouldn't. I've had in my classroom teenagers coming to their lessons with workbooks that were already filled in with the answers, even though we told them to erase the answers. But the parents, thinking that it would help, said, "No, we won't." Secondhand books that have all the answers because it will help their children. So this is an issue. Now they also crowdsource searchers, which means that they look for information as a team. They rely on the recommendation of others. So that's something we can use it within our classroom. Therefore, FOMO, FOMU, FOBU, so fear of missing out, fear of messing up, or fear of better options, which means that lots and lots of indecisions when it comes to deciding on something. The do-gooders, they want to actually make a positive impact on the world. So think charities, think think that due to this, what you can do when it comes to projects or tasks, using this need to actually have a positive impact on the world. Another thing about them is that they're authentical. Obviously authentic, artificial. So they pretend to be authentic. Think about Instagram, the post that they put up about perfect lives when for real it's just a snippet of their life. So they have to balance artificial and authentic attitude. So it's posing, pretending to be doing nothing when for real you prepared it for 3 hours for the perfect Instagram post or the perfect Instagram picture. Some of them are individualistic, so collaboration can be quite difficult. And another very important option is that they are just-in-time learners, which means not just in case. They learn this because normally we tend to learn languages not because we need it for tomorrow, but just in case we might need it for work, for promotion. It will help us in the future. It'll give us information, useful information, but in time. For them it has to be useful just now. So we need to think of activities that cater for that favorably for teaching this particular generation. Now, think about these. Just take 30 seconds to reflect on how these can affect your class. And which one do you think actually, which of these criteria would you say affects your class, your teenagers' classes the most? Put that in the chat. Think about it and put it in the chat. As we go on, think about it and then add your ideas in the chat. Now, another thing that we need to know about teenagers is that 26 has been declared as the new 18. So students might not be as mature as we would expect them to be at that age. It is quite different from their predecessors. Why? Because maturity tends to come from risk taking, but as we mentioned, they are quite risk adverse. The prefrontal cortex is not developed, so risk is taken more slowly. They can't measure risk because they haven't been exposed. So that's something that we need to be aware of, that we can't just go, well, when I was your age, I used to, because the goalpost has changed. Now, another thing about teenagers is that they are not bilingual, but they are bilingual. When they feel that they can't deal with things, they might just quit because they can't cope. So what do all these criteria mean? Then there's a need to motivate students. Why? Because, as I said, as I mentioned before, teenagers often have no obvious reason for learning English. They are, especially at school, they are there because they have to. It's part of the curriculum. Also, maybe even in a language center. They're not there because they want to. If they had the choice, they would much prefer being pretty much doing anything else than being in the classroom teaching English. So, because there's no obvious reason for learning English, then we need to motivate them. We need to ensure that they are engaged and that when they are in the classroom, they are fully in the classroom. So, how can we do this? Well, the way we do this is by fostering autonomy and to develop student fronted classroom. But how? Autonomy is not just it's much more than students doing things just on their own. This is impossible. We can't just tell them, okay, now you just do this. It is a slow process, but autonomy is essential. So the idea is that the more teenagers get to do in class, then the more they will engage with the language and the more they will learn. Um, we as teachers, practitioners, have been told that we have to consider all the different roles that we have in the classroom. We should be the sage on the side. We should be the facilitator. We shouldn't be the one who gives the information, but we should be the one that elicits. Well, what about our students? What about teenagers? We need to also think, and this is one possible task for you, list all the possible roles that your teenagers could perform in your classroom. Think about it. What could be some of the roles that you could give your students in order to foster that autonomy? And we're not just talking about handing out, giving out handouts or wiping the board. We're talking about real tasks. Teenagers know what they like. Teenagers are informed. So if you try to pass off giving out handouts as, let's say, a way to deal with or to develop autonomy, then this will not fly. They know that when they're being tricked. So, how can we really foster autonomy? And we have to think about the different roles that we can assign our students. So, it involves autonomy for teenagers, involves students actively making decisions on how to execute language tasks. And they have to be informed, prepared, and supported by the teacher. There has to be some kind of scaffolding going on. You cannot just let them tell them, okay, you do this, and not provide them with scaffolding or with support, because then you are setting them up for failure. And remember, motivation comes from actively successfully doing something that gives you the motivation to do more. If you give them something to do and they fail at it miserably because of your lack of support, then you're just creating even a worse condition than, a worse environment than what was initially in your classroom. So how can we do this? Then these elements actually form a whole. In order to make decisions, students need to be active. Okay. But in order to be active, they need to use some initiative during the exercise, but they also need to be given the space in which to act. So, in order to be given that space, the teacher needs to feel confident that the students will be able to achieve what they're supposed to do and not let the group down. So how can you do that? Again, this has to be done through scaffolding. So we're talking about being the teacher. How? One of the ways is, if you want to start within your classroom, is teens teaching teens. Not easy, I have to admit. It's not the easiest of things to oversee, but it is extremely rewarding. You just have to set it up properly. So how to do this? Students are put into groups, and each group is, let's say, assigned a page from the course book and a date in which to teach that lesson or that part of the lesson. Very important that you give them ample time to plan and prepare their lesson. We're talking about class time. Do not give them that as extra homework because they'll just see it as punishment. This needs to be really integrated within your lesson so it feels really something organic within your lesson. Another a way to help out would be to give them something like a lesson plan template. And each member of the group is responsible for filling something out. And this is a great idea that I took from some of the books that I read. Please have a look at the bibliography at the end. Amazing resources to take some ideas from and to develop this idea further. It is great. It's a very powerful vehicle for language because they get to not only show off their skills when it comes to communication, but also their skills when it comes to organization. So this is really something that is quite good, and it's contained within your classroom, so it doesn't feel like you need to do it outside. Another thing, if you have the support of your DOS or the support of your school director, is teaching primary. It's this if you teach, for example, in the language center and you've got younger learners, teenage classes, or in a larger class, then this is great. You can invite your teams to teach the little ones, the younger ones. So it can be teaching maybe another teacher's primary class. It could be, teaching them, simple things like colors, shape. This is extremely rewarding for learners. And also, don't forget, in order to foster engagement, you could also, whoever does this, most likely on a volunteer basis, you can add an additional, maybe +1 or a positive comment on their report card or something like that. Something else they can do, being the teacher, is the class-to-class presentation, whereby let's say that grade 10 would go and explain to the grade 9 what they can expect the next year. There, and also maybe giving them some recommended study tips from the older kids to the younger kids. This is very rewarding for both of them. The grade 9 or the lower grade always finds it very interesting to be told by their peers, older peers, what they can expect. And the older kids, your teenagers, learn so much from being able to pass on their knowledge to the grade down. Now, these are some activities that you can do within using the course book, using the material already given. But what also would work, another great way to ensure autonomy and engagement, but still have language learning, is through the use of different lesson framework, and one of them would be TBL. So what exactly is TBL? The TBL, task-based learning, focuses on using real-life tasks to help students learn language. So what is essential with TBL is that you need to identify the tasks the students actually need. Now, some of you will say, well, they don't need anything. They're teenagers. Well, that's not true. They might need something. Maybe it could be something like posting an Instagram, story, or this is important to get to know what they actually need to use English for in their real life. So that's the first thing you need to do. Find and the user needs analysis to find out what they need. Then you need to plan out the tasks so that the students do the tasks that match those needs. Language input is provided, however, only when the students need it to complete the tasks. So language is a tool. It's not the end goal, but language learning happens at the right time. It helps make the learning process more practical and also much more relevant. They don't feel as if they're being taught, let's say, the third conditional or something like that. They are doing something actively for their real life, but at the same time, they're having some kind of input of language. Obviously, if you feel that if, for example, you have the students in groups and one group requires input on, let's say if it's about giving advice, they need some help on if I were you, I would, second conditional, useful giving advice. Then you provide help for that particular, the inputs for that particular group, but maybe turns out that everybody needs. So you can interrupt the task, give them a very short kind of input on that particular language that has been identified by you for all the groups needed, and then they continue with the task. So it's not as if you're teaching language and then you ask them to do something where they need that language, which is quite unnatural. It's the opposite. They need something, they do something that they need for real life, and you're just helping them. You're just inputting whatever they require. And students really feel supported and listened to because you're not giving them a grammar lesson for no reason. You're giving them a grammar lesson, or let's say grammar input or vocab input, or even some work on phonology, but because it helps them with a goal. How can we do this? How do we prepare a task-based PBL class? Well, as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is a needs analysis. That is the first thing we need to establish. We need to establish the actual needs of the learners. You cannot do a TBL lesson if you haven't established this. Otherwise, you're just, again, imposing your assumptions on the learners. Remember what happened when I was teaching? This is why the teenagers didn't like it. So a needs analysis is essential. Now remember, they might not know immediately what they want to do. So you can let them brainstorm in groups, or you can give them some time to think about it. Now needs analysis formats can be found on lots of different websites. And so and you need to obviously adapt it to your learners so that the format is easy for them to understand. So once you've done the needs analysis, the first thing is the pre-task. Now, the pre-task, it can take a whole lesson. It can take not that long, but you need to introduce the task to the students. Get them motivated to solve it. Even though it is something they require in real life, hopefully this will be enough, but still. Once everyone is actually interested, then you need to explain what is expected in the task. There has to be clear, concise, and complete instructions. Maybe you need to, if you want, some people would think that you would need to demo the task. It would be kind of a weekend TBL lesson where you provide a demo and then they work on, based on the demo. You can provide it, or you can just explain it properly, what it is that is expected from the task. It can be, so as I mentioned, it can be an example from the teacher, can be a listening, it can be a speaking, can be a video, can be showing actual tasks being done by someone else, or even what is really interesting is that if you have previous students' work to show, so that you can explain that it was done by a previous student. So it does help also motivation, as in if they could do it, so can we. So you obviously provide instructions, you provide advice on how to approach the task, and then you do the actual task. So the students, this is the main stage. of the lesson. They start working on the task, can be in groups of threes, can be in pairs, and this needs to be done ideally in English, but if there is some preparation, let's say some research that needs to be done in L1, and then it's absolutely fine, as long as the product, the task in itself, is in done in the target language, which is English in this case. However, make sure that you follow the rules about the use of L1 within your school and your language centers, as I know that different places will have different rules about what the students, which language the students can use. But L1 does have its place, especially when it comes to research, if you want to really have them develop, something quite important when it comes to tasks. Now, once they've done the research, then they start, working on the task. The task itself has to be done in English. And why? Is because they need to feel the need to use the language they want to learn in order to do the task. That you don't actually join the work process. You're monitoring, and you offer hints, linguist. It can be you can offer support about what to do, or you can help when it comes to language. This is where the input is where needed. Okay, this is what language is about. It's there to help them do something. The language in itself is not the end product, it's just the tool. And having this format really helps emphasize this, not only for the students, but also for the teachers. At times we tend to forget that we want them to use the language for something and not just for filling in a gap fill activity. And then you also have the post task where the students have completed the task, they have presented it. You've got the review stage, also known as the post task. So here it's good for the students to let the students evaluate each other's task. But ask them to evaluate maybe the content. Remember, it is about the task, not the language. Here it's important that you give them a communicative focus, a reason, a purpose for looking at. So which, let's just say, which one do you agree, disagree, which one is more interesting, something that gives them a reason to read or to review the task. So really allow them to give feedback on the content of the task to each other. You, if you want, can do a bit of a review of the frequently made errors during the task. Remember, the peer feedback can be done in form of comments. It can be done in form of feedback discussion. Could even be done through a checklist. Have they achieved all the aims? It basically, and it offers students an opportunity to reflect on each other's work and to analyze their work and other students' work in order to improve their skill for the future. So why should we do this? Think about it, brainstorm, try to think. What couple of why would TBL be positive in ELT for teens based on what we've just discussed? Go for it. Share in the chat. I see some. Yes, you're correct. Some good ideas. Yes, you're right. I mean, the fact that the most important thing is that the students solve tasks that are relevant to their own lives. I mean, when was the last time they needed to write? I mean, how many times did we do that to our teenagers? Write a postcard to your whoever, describing your latest holiday. When was the last time they actually wrote a postcard? When was the last time we wrote a postcard? Let alone them. I don't remember the last time I did that. And yet we keep asking them to do this. So having them do relevant and interesting tasks means that they will be engaged. The fact that they need to use the target language, they're learning to communicate with their peers. So it gives them a reason to want to improve. This is authentic language. We use English right now. I'm using English, which is not my mother tongue. I'm using it to communicate with you the message that I want to convey about teaching teenagers. This is authentic use of language. I'm not thinking, am I using the target language properly? Am I using the third conditional like my teacher just told me? I'm trying to convey a message. There is an authentic use of language, and task-based learning allows that. Furthermore, it is especially conducive to group learning. Now, we did mention that sometimes they're quite individualistic teenagers. However, this does help them, learning language as a group. It's a very important contributor to effective retention, collaborating with others, becoming confident. It's key to acquiring the language, and it does help, especially when, group identity is so important at their age. Remember the characteristics that we read about for teenagers. It does increase their confidence, increase their motivation due to all of this. And on top of it, like we mentioned, it's realistic. The language is relevant to their personal lives. And also, something that is not only for teenagers, but for yourself as students, as teachers, a solid knowledge of this kind of method does increase, your teaching range, being able to teach TBL classes. This is also something good for you as a personal development, going away from the course book into more what the students actually need. This is, if you want to start, there's a great idea for a task. Obviously, this, remember, it's a needs analysis. So if it doesn't work for your context and it is not what your students require, then obviously, don't. But I found it in a book, and I actually used this in one of my classes because it was needed. So it's about an unused room we had an unused room in our language center, and they were going to use it. I can't remember. They were going to make it, I think, at a computer room or something like that. Not something essential, but they were thinking it might be good to have more computers. So what I asked them is that I made them, I put them into two small teams, and they had to think about users for the room with the advantages and the disadvantages, not just for them, but also for the language center, the cheapest, the most environmental friendly. And they had to present as like a kind of like project to the class. If I remember, we used an app. I think it was done. No, it wasn't done through an app. I think it was done through an Instagram video or something like that. And then the best one was shown to the DOS. Now, I'm not saying that we swayed the DOS in any way, shape, or form, but at least we tried. Okay, at least we tried. Now, this is one way of we can do teaching learners and having higher engagement when it comes to teenager. As we mentioned, one of the great changes that happen to teenagers is that the way that when the change that occurs in the way that the students solve problems, their capacity for problem solving really, and for abstract thinking, blossoms. We talked about the young teenagers starting to have the opportunity, to see, to have abstract reasoning and to hypothesize, and that capacity being developed in middle teenagers. Well, this really does develop more and more. They become better at daily planning, they become better at decision making, they possess the capacity for understanding consequences. So all these things need to be channeled into a way of teaching. This is what's really important. They have this possibility to do more because they are developing the abstract reasoning, they're developing this cause consequence reasoning. They can think, and this is why it is extremely important that we think about using project-based learning. Project-based learning is basically a project, it's an extended piece of work on a particular topic, and what's essential is that the content and the presentation are basically determined principally by the learners. Now, you can make it as difficult and as easy as you want, and all this will fit the project to you have to fit that to the learner's level and obviously the appropriate cognitive load. Okay, if you ask too much of them, then the task will become too heavy for them, will become too impossible for them. So make sure that maybe you start with something quite light and then you make it less challenging. So you start with, so you make it more challenging. So less challenge with, let's say, research and present. Then we go through to story, article writing, then design problem, a business problem, maybe a research project. So as they develop their ability, then you can present them with more challenge, like a real project. So we can scaffold them into like parts of a project first and then ask them for that. So why on earth should we ask them to use project work, and how can it be a positive in the ELT classroom? Well, as it's quite similar to TBL in the fact that it is extremely motivating. It provides learner with opportunities for personal engagement, which is something that's sorely missing from our course book led classes. It does suit learners with different strengths and weaknesses. It allows them to do what they feel they are capable of doing. It is authentic in terms of task, and we will see some example. And there's negotiation. They have to negotiate within their group on content. They have to negotiate within their group on the methodology, on the output. So it encourages and develops creativity. It's not just one skill we're talking about them. They have to read for research. They have to maybe listen also for research, but they also have to listen to each other. They have to speak, they have to write within their group. And so there is a clear output for their communication. Whatever is coming out, whatever they're producing will have a clear output. And it's not only fluency based, but also accuracy based, because what they present has to be accurate. So it links very nicely task-based approaches, and it can really prime acquisition, because as they are actually teaching, then they notice a gap in their language to be able to express their idea. And this is where you come in. Okay, you are the guide on the side. You just help with whatever is needed and when they required. So it does ask you to take a step back, but you still are present. You really are helping them out. And you're fostering this autonomy, this need for independence that we talked about that the learners at that age require. So, how do they do that? The first one is obviously the pre-project planning. Can be teacher-led, it can be student-led. This is up to you. Then they introduce the project. You can also have some example projects, and then from that they decide which one they want to do, and you set the goals. So it talks about the format. How will it be? What will the output be? Who will do what? Roles and responsibility. When will it be? What are the materials that will be needed? Once this has been decided, then they work on that project, and then the project is presented. You would think that's the end. No, exactly like the task-based learning, there is an assessment feedback stage, which is quite necessary because they have to get feedback on their work. Imagine they've worked for months and months and months on something, and then all of a sudden, that's it. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next project. That's the reason why feedback stages are essential in classes. You need to provide that content feedback. If you want to provide some linguistic feedback, make sure that it is needed. Don't just fall back into, okay, now we're going to go through the whatever you've decided. This has to be because you or them noticed the gap and you want to maybe pursue it a little bit more because you notice there's something missing. Now, remember, feedback is not only on what went wrong. Remember to deal with emergent language. How can you extend the knowledge, the language that they're using? So running successful ELT projects are not difficult, but you need to decide whether you want to make it quite loose, so it's student formulated, or tight output, as in it's because it's driven by the curriculum. You need, there needs to be a decision on degree of choice when it comes to the topic, the output type, the way of working. Will it be mostly done in the classroom, outside? What about the use of L1 when it comes to research? Would doing everything in all the research in L2 just put too much cognitive load on the learners? Would L1 help? And as we mentioned, emergent language. We are talking about when they notice a gap. That's when you jump in, and then you not only reformulate if there's something that is wrong, but also you try to stretch it. Okay, how can we say this, but maybe in a different way? So you stretch the language that they've produced. So who's involved? We have the students, we have the teachers. So the students, they have to think, you have to obviously grade the task, they have to think about the output. They're not language learners here. You as the teacher is the language expert. You need to be ready to work with emergent language. You need to have a bit of control, but also allow student autonomy. But these are not the only actors. You also have the local people and students in the other classes that might want to see those projects. There might be experts that might come in and provide some help. Parents, they might want to be able to see what's happening. Like, what do you mean you're not learning about the third condition? What are you doing? So that's also something that you can show the projects to. Now, there are lots of different areas and formats for project. These are some of them. Um, Obviously, these are two of them that I've noticed. I believe this was from a website. I put the bibliography I put the link in the bibliography. I personally really like the Create Your Own website, and so did my students. So they have to design a solution to a problem. So they have to identify a problem. Can be in their community, can be with their age group, can be within their class, can be within anything, and they can create a website to advertise the solution. So we're talking about with clear reasons, relevant evidence to influence the buyers. The PSA is a little bit dated, I have to admit, but you never know. There might be an issue at the moment within the classroom or within the school, within the community that needs to be addressed. There are so many other things you can do. You can do, for example, with graded readers, which, normally brings a shudder to when you say it to the students. Well, what about creating a board game based on, Wuthering Heights or whatever graded readers you made them read? Or so they have to, the project would be to create a sheet of instructions which show how to play the game. Maybe they have to create a presentation to share with a games manufacturer. You can use some music. So they have to make a CD cover. They have to video an interview with the band. They have to write gig reviews. Um, it could be also, if you remember what we talked about, them being interested in being do-gooders. So what about doing something to spread awareness of a local food bank and increase their donation? So they could do some research about it and then disseminate calls for donation, volunteer, advertise the service to communities that might need it, but they're not aware. They can create their own podcast. So they create a story or message. We ask them for storytelling, but why make them write it? Why not make them do a podcast? Remember, they are prosumers. They produce and consume information, and that would be a great way to link that there. So they would research the topic, develop the script, record, publish. There are hosting platforms like Podbean, SoundCloud, where they could actually do that. And you could ask the rest of the class to connect their podcast to you could ask each member of the group to connect their podcast to a curriculum unit or subject, or they can come up with their own thing. We could even organize a field trip with a purpose. They have to plan a field trip to study something, in their community, something that's important. So, for example, they can enlist the help of like local experts. So let's say it's something about trash that's being collected. So they want to plan a field trip to go and study the effect of trash being collected outside of their class, not outside of the classroom, but outside of outside of the classroom in the community. So loads and loads of ideas. So it projects. Sorry for the pun. They can be projectastic. So there are loads of reasons for doing it. It offers more than just linguistic benefits. It really develops. It caters to their needs as teenagers and as Gen Zs and alphas. It really does. It the important thing is that even though it is about creating autonomy, it does still require some pre-lesson planning. So don't, we're not getting off that easily. It isn't a soft option, okay? It can actually be quite demand high, and it also will allow you and allow you and them to work with emergent language and really basically be able to respond to their linguistic needs and not just ask them to use the language for no purpose at all. As mentioned before, here are some very interesting books and resources where some of my ideas came from. Please, I encourage you to have a look at them. They are very, very good.